Greetings, everyone. I'm Graham Wilson, the director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University, and I want to welcome you to this seminar on COVID-19 and cities. How are cities coping? This crisis has placed unprecedented responsibility on cities and their mayors. We've all been saying for some time that failure of leadership in Washington, D.C. has placed additional responsibilities on cities and their mayors. But this crisis has illustrated that point in abundance. Today we're seeing governors and mayors being required to fill a leadership gap that has otherwise existed in our political system. The crisis, as we know, has got two dimensions. One is the public health dimension, questions of life and death for our citizens. And the other is the economic consequences of that crisis, and economic consequences that are endangering the livelihoods and well-being of millions of our fellow citizens. So there are very important questions that we have to discuss arising from COVID and its economic consequences. We've got two great speakers today to address those issues. Katie Einstein from the Department of Political Science at Boston University, where she's a professor, is somebody who is known to many of you as one of the principal investigators on the annual Menino Survey of Mayors. She's the author or co-author of numerous other books and articles, most recently the much discussed Neighborhood Defenders book on the politics of zoning and the availability of multi-family housing in our communities. We also have with us Bruce Katz, who almost needs no introduction. He's known to everyone concerned with cities. His books, The Metropolitan Revolution and the New Localism, have defined discussions of cities. He's the director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, and we're delighted to have him with us today. Katie is going to go first, but before she starts, I'm going to ask David Krause, a new member of our staff whom nobody's really had the chance to meet in person yet, introduce himself and say just a few words about housekeeping for the seminar.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Krause. I'm the program manager and administrator for the Initiative on Cities. Working remotely as all of us are. As Graham noted, Katie Einstein is going to go first, followed by Bruce Katz. Throughout the webinar, you can access, there should be a little button that says Q&A on the bottom of your Zoom window. Throughout the webinar at any time, you can submit a Q&A using that feature. Instead of having everyone speak their questions, it'll be more orderly if we just if everyone submits Q&As through Zoom by text. If you see questions that have been submitted by others that you like, you should be able to upvote them. It's a new Zoom feature that's in beta, but we're hoping that it works pretty well today. And we'll do our best at the end. Graham will moderate a Q&A session for the last 20 minutes or so. And we'll hope to get through as many questions as we can. As a last bit before we go to Katie, we are recording this session and we'll post it to our YouTube afterwards. And Zoom will also store it in the cloud, and you'll be able to watch via the registration link that you use to open this webinar. You should be able to watch the recording once Zoom finishes processing after the session, in case you need to revisit. And with that, I'll hand this over to Katie, and we can get started.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm delighted to be on this panel to get to talk about this really important policy issue along with Bruce Katz. So yeah, thanks, and I really look forward to your questions. So let me just screen share here my slides. So we were really interested as a research team in documenting just how local governments are responding to this crisis and understanding the range of ways that they're approaching this really challenging issue. And part of the reason that we're interested in how local governments are challenging this incredibly pressing policy area is that right now the federal government response can at best really be described as weak and disorganized. There hasn't been a coherent response and lots of support across an array of policy areas from the federal government. So given that sort of absence of federal coordination, we've really seen state and local governments step into that gap with aggressive policy responses across a wide domain. And this is true of Republican and Democratic governors, it's true of courts, it's true of city councilors, it's true of mayors. We've seen it across party lines and across a variety of different state and local offices. So one of the projects that I've been working on with my Boston University colleagues, David Glick and Max Palmer, is to really think about when local leaders have made statements about COVID-19. So one of the first things that we did was to just basically understand in a rough sense, when did leaders start paying attention to this big issue? And so we scraped all of the tweets from the nation's largest cities just to understand sort of when did they start talking about COVID-19. And what's interesting to us is first that there's a range in when these local leaders started tweeting a lot about this and at least publicly spending a lot of time focusing on COVID-19. But there's also a sizable cluster of mayors that were thinking about this issue as early as January, February, well in advance of when national leaders were taking this as a serious policy issue worthy of lots of investment and aggressive policy response. So we take this as great evidence that at least for a sizable number of local leaders, mayors were genuinely taking the lead in this policy arena. And so how are they doing this? We document local governments taking the lead in a variety of different ways. Some of them, many of them, I should say, have engaged in shelter-in-place orders or declarations of emergencies. They've closed down non-essential businesses. They've regulated restaurants and grocery stores, regulating who can go inside, how many people, how can food be delivered. There's also been a whole series of housing reforms. Some local governments and state governments have tackled limiting evictions and foreclosures, and providing housing relief and housing support for those who find themselves without. We've also really seen a variety of local leaders taking a stand. It isn't just sort of one type of official that's taking leadership. One thing that's been really striking to us is a disparate group of political actors that have come together to approach these pressing policy challenges. So we've seen examples of city councilors negotiating with their local housing courts, right? Or mayors talking with sheriffs about how to enforce evictions. This is requiring a variety of different local and state officials to work together to address this crisis. So it's not just one type of official taking a stand. This is really a multi-level governance approach across a variety of different legislative and executive and court officials. What I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about today is how these local leaders have tackled housing issues. I'm a housing policy person, and so this is an area that is near and dear to me and is a really pressing concern given the vulnerability of many urban residents to housing instability before this crisis hit. And what we find is that there's a lot of evidence out there right now that COVID-19 really presents a crisis for both homeowners and renters. You have to be worried about eviction and foreclosure, how to pay rent, how to do mortgage payments, how to deal with property taxes coming up. These are all really significant issues, and they're issues that state and local governments can help with. So we know that the federal government has thus far taken some action primarily on mortgage support. Insofar as there's been sort of coordinated, centralized government action, it's really happened for homeowners and really thinking about how to support folks who have mortgage payments who may no longer be able to pay them because of health issues or job losses. But this has really left rent and property tax relief to be an issue of state and local governments. The federal government really hasn't done a whole lot in that arena right now. And so given that local governments are sort of being tasked with this huge responsibility, BU political scientist Max Palmer and I went out and collected information from the 50 largest cities in the United States. And we documented whether these cities had engaged in any form of eviction protection, rent relief, foreclosure protection, mortgage relief, or property tax relief. Because, as I mentioned, this is a really complicated arena where multiple levels of government have been taking action, what our data set captures is one of two things. It captures either when local governments took action before the state government in implementing a policy, or when local governments provided more generous support than their state government. So it's really documenting sort of when local governments took the lead in some sense over their state government in either providing generous support or in their timing in implementing these policies. And what we find in collecting data across these arenas is that a large number of local governments are really, the area that they're most commonly taking a stand is eviction bans. Over 60% of the nation's 50 largest cities have passed some form of moratorium on evictions that either happened in advance of their state governments or goes beyond what their state government has mandated. We also found that over a quarter of cities have provided some form of rent relief. And this has taken a variety of forms. Some cities have actually temporarily banned rent increases. Others have provided really generous sources of funds for people who are income eligible to apply to receive money to support their rent, while others have sort of more lottery-based programs that are designed to help folks with their rent. We do see a smaller share of cities taking on things like delaying property taxes and some form of mortgage relief. But really, when we look at mortgage relief and foreclosures, it does look like local governments are much less likely to sort of be active in that area, probably in large part because the federal government has actually taken some action for homeowners. So I wanted to provide a couple of sort of more, that's the big top line approach, but I wanted to look a little bit more in depth at a few cases of local governments that have engaged in these kinds of policy responses. And so the two cities I'm going to give you guys a little bit of insight into are Oakland, California and Boston, Massachusetts. So Oakland, California has taken the approach of limiting rent hikes, which is a pretty aggressive approach for handling sort of these rent issues. So they have said that through June 30th, landlords cannot raise the rents by more than 3.5%. They've also passed an eviction ban through May 31st, and that eviction ban actually stretches beyond May 31st if tenants are unable to pay rent due to a financial hardship related to COVID-19. They banned late fees for rent payments during the pandemic missed due to sort of issues related to COVID-19. Importantly though, and this is true of almost every local government, this is not a rent freeze. This is not an issue where renters are never going to be held accountable for this money. Renters must still at some point pay back the full rent to landlords, but the city of Oakland spells out that repayment can be quite slow, and that slow repayment of that back rent can never be used as grounds for eviction. So a second approach, and really innovative one, is coming out of Boston, Massachusetts, which is actually one of the few cities to set aside money for both renters and homeowners. So the first thing that Boston has done is to create a $3 million fund to help Bostonians pay their rent. And the way that this fund works is that income eligible tenants who are at risk of losing their rental housing can apply to the fund, and they can get up to $4,000 to help them pay their rent. The management of it is also pretty interesting. It's managed jointly by the city government along with nonprofits. And one intriguing aspect of Boston's approach to tackling these issues is they've really been going with public-private partnerships. And you'll see this too on their mortgage relief, that they're really working jointly with their nonprofit community and also the private sector. Boston has passed a number of other rental protections. One interesting thing, again, showing the different levels of government having to work together. Boston, very early on in March, urged local housing courts to ban evictions. The part that they had direct control over, the Boston Housing Authority, they immediately had them stop pursuing all non-essential evictions. And the Boston Housing Authority and Boston Public Schools have created a partnership to house up to 1,000 BPS student families at risk of displacement over the next year. Boston has also been one of the only cities in the country to really think about mortgage relief. And so the city of Boston has actually worked with 12 of the largest lenders in the city to offer at least 3 months of deferred mortgage payments for those who are financially impacted by the public health crisis. They also have worked out an agreement with lenders that they won't charge late fees or report non-payments to the credit bureau, and homeowners will not be required to pay back deferred payments lump sum. So just in summary, I think there's a lot of really exciting policy activism happening at lower levels of government. We've seen really complicated partnerships between city councilors, mayors, courts, and school systems. We've also seen partnerships between different local governments. You know, in our area, we had multiple school systems coordinate with each other to close down. There's a lot of regional cooperation happening here. And we've seen, you know, at the state level, different governors working together to determine when to reopen the economy. We've seen partnerships a lot of the time between state and local government. We've also seen some conflict where some state governments that may have some ideological gaps, some governors would have ideological gaps with local governments, have fought back with mayors who want to have shelter in place or more aggressive social distancing measures. While this activism is really exciting, I want to emphasize that state and local governments are still limited by funding and coordination problems from the federal government. They can do a lot, but they could also do a lot more in these important policy areas with support from higher levels of government. So thank you, and with that, I want to turn this over to Bruce.
Great, thanks, Katie. That was phenomenal. What I'm going to talk about actually builds right from there, because going back to early March, a number of cities began to realize that this economic shutdown was going to have devastating effects on their small business. And they realized that this was not going to be a typical kind of natural disaster, where essentially you have a weather event, let's say, it's geographically contained, and it's time limited. This is a hurricane hitting all parts of the United States, and we don't particularly know when it's going to end. But we do know that many small businesses, particularly those businesses that have employees between 0 sole proprietorships and 20, are very vulnerable to these kinds of economic shocks. They have very little cash on reserves. Particularly in the food and beverage sector and in other sectors of the economy that tend to be more Main Street businesses. So what began to happen in early March is a few first mover cities that basically were hit first by the crisis, Seattle, San Francisco, New York, began to establish local relief funds. And as every week progressed through March and on into this month, dozens, hundreds of more cities began to join them, because again, Washington's response to this was in many respects too late. And I'll go into that in some detail. These funds are not uniform by any stretch. They reflect the fact that cities are not governments, they're networks. So some funds have been formed by municipal government, the Birmingham Fund, for example, in Alabama. Some have been formed by public authorities, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority. Some by philanthropies, the New Haven Community Foundation. Some by business chambers like the Indianapolis Chamber. And some by local financial institutions or national financial institutions. Goldman Sachs, for example, has basically capitalized the Rhode Island Fund. Rhode Island is a city-state, essentially, which opened up yesterday, literally, and was oversubscribed within 5 hours. $10 million, 5 hours. What we're finding about these local and state funds is that they have certain characteristics which are really critical to this crisis at a time when the federal government is coming in with large amounts of funding. But what needs to be understood about the federal relief, either the Small Business Administration Paycheck Protection Program or the Small Business Administration Economic Injury Disaster Loans, is that they define small businesses as any business with less than 500 employees. Now that's a fairly broad, overbroad definition of small business. And the way that those programs work is they tend to favor small businesses that already have banking relationships. So as these local and state funds were set up, they particularly targeted very small businesses, micro businesses, particularly Black and Brown owned businesses that do not tend to have, in many cases, these traditional banking relationships. They tend to be self-funded in many respects. And many of these firms, particularly Black and Brown owned businesses, are younger than white owned businesses. They were formed in many cases in the last couple years. So a couple things about these state and local funds. They focus on micro business. They basically activate all the networks that a city has. So even if the fund is administered by one sector, let's say the government or a public authority, it may actually have capital that has been invested or donated by other sectors. And it actually may use community development finance institutions as their fiscal agent to distribute the funds, whether they're grants, whether they're loans. And it will use the entire network to communicate the existence of this fund and provide technical assistance so small businesses can basically apply. So this is the full city effect that we have. Again, the federal programs have tended to operate in these verticals. They tend to operate primarily with financial institutions that already have existing relationships with the SBA, though the SBA can expand that. And we haven't really activated all the distribution channels or the capacity of the country to respond to this crisis. So there's several things as we move forward here. Once cities begin to innovate, whether it's on the housing side, as Katie is describing, or on the small business side, what generally tends to happen fairly quickly is cities watch each other and they steal from each other and they repeat from each other. And so what we've had in the last couple of weeks, some of my colleagues and myself, also our partner Accelerator for America, have begun to codify these different funds, even providing documentation on our websites so that there can be a speed of replication and a speed of adaptation across the country. At the same time, we realize that the big money, the big capital, has to come from the national government. So a week ago today, we proposed a Main Street Emergency Act, which would be a parallel system to the SBA loan programs. And we called for about $50 billion that would be allocated in direct assistance to cities, counties, and states so that they could top up their relief funds and again target on these underserved businesses and underserved communities. In the next day or so, Senator Booker, former mayor of Newark, now senator from New Jersey, and Senator Daines from Montana, this is bipartisan, will introduce their version of the Main Street Emergency Act. It'll be called the Small Business Local Relief Act. It'll also be sponsored and introduced in the House. And my hope is, literally within the next week, if not sooner, that this becomes a new vehicle, a new distribution channel, so that small businesses, particularly those with less than 20 employees, particularly those located in low-income communities, can begin to receive capital that's more fit to purpose. And that is not just basically administered by large banks, distant banks that don't have relationships and don't have the trust relationship with many of these small businesses. We are already late to this in this crisis. Many small businesses have less than 2 weeks of cash on reserve. Some have a month on reserve. This has been going on in some parts of the United States for the last 5 weeks. My concern is we are going to lose many small businesses here. The more small businesses we lose, particularly Main Street businesses, the harder it is going to be to rebuild those portions of our cities, our commercial corridors, our main streets, our downtowns, the areas around our anchor institutions. And it will take not just some time to rebuild and recover, but it also will take different business models. If we wake up whenever we are allowed to leave our basements and begin to congregate again, though there will clearly be many rules around that if we don't have a vaccine or a cure, I think we're going to end up with cities, as they've already done on the relief side, as they've already done on the housing side, beginning to innovate with new business models. Because small businesses, once they fail, do not come back fast. They have their credit basically circumscribed. So their ability to raise capital, and particularly because they've lost income, their own ability to raise capital from friends and family, how many small businesses start, will be greatly limited. So I think we're going to end up with new collective models for the restoration of our main streets and our commercial corridors, where there may be a master organization, intermediary, providing the rental platform for many small businesses and actually taking responsibility for equipment and infrastructure and accounting and legal and technology and so forth. So this is a new kind of cooperative model that might actually emerge in the United States, building off of models in Northern Europe. It's going to require different financial products, different legal mechanisms. But I think if we don't do this, this recovery will set us back in many of our cities where we were beginning to make progress on growing the size and the scale, particularly of Black and Brown-owned businesses. So with that, I'll end and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Katie. Let me sort of jump in with the first question, which is about the consequences for cities themselves. One of the things that is obviously happening right now is that cities are not getting tax revenue that they would normally receive. I mean, I assume that we're looking at, amongst other problems for cities, a gigantic fiscal problem. Do either of you have any thoughts about that? Do you think that Washington will provide help on this score? Will that be enough? As I say, thoughts on the fiscal plight of cities.
So I'm not sure sort of how to estimate the likelihood of Washington providing support, but I think some of the evidence that we see of this is cities' relative reluctance to provide property tax relief. You know, there's a small share of cities that are delaying property tax payments, but I think understandably, a lot of cities are already starting to feel this crisis, worry about their future revenue streams, and frankly can't afford to even offer delays in property taxes. So I suspect that's going to be like the very early way we start to get a sense of which cities are already feeling the financial pinch.
Yeah, cities have varied revenue bases. Some rely on property, some on sales, some on income. We already are seeing Detroit, because of the loss of taxes from the casino sector, basically say that they're looking at several years of monumental fiscal holes. The feds are going to have to step in. They stepped in with the third response package. They are now considering $150 billion for states and localities as part of this necessary expansion of relief for small business. This is an issue of enormous contention in Washington right now. It's a contention of how much should the federal government provide the states and localities, and when should they provide it. So I would expect in the next day or so, you'll be hearing about negotiations between the Republicans and the Democrats in both the House and the Senate side and with the White House about how much fiscal relief they'll provide and when they will provide it. But this is a live conversation in this town right now.
Great. Thank you both. We have questions from our participating audience. One of the first was perhaps for you, Bruce. Is any rent help available for small business establishments through the federal programs, or are we dependent on the networks that you've been describing?
Well, the first line of defense, actually, for many small businesses are their landlords and their lenders. Many of the landlords obviously are also small businesses. So this has a sort of domino effect, but every small business is its own kind of ecosystem. And we have seen relief coming from many landlords for their small businesses through the month of April. The federal programs, particularly the large program, the $350 billion Paycheck Protection Program, is primarily an effort to help businesses with their payrolls, though there is a portion of the resources that businesses receive that could be used for rent as well. Local programs tend to be a little more flexible because they're listening very closely to their small businesses, many of whom have already laid off or furloughed many of their employees. So there's this big back and forth about if you're paying small businesses to basically keep employees employed, but they've already gone on unemployment, you know, we have some staging and sequencing issues to deal with here. So there's multiple layers here, but one of the reasons why we have been advocating for more distribution channels and more flexible resources to go directly to states, cities, and counties is they're more likely to understand the variance of needs that exist across multiple kinds of small businesses, from the micro 0 to 20 employees on up to those with 500 employees. So this is a complicated economy in this country where one size doesn't fit all, and we should be activating as many of these channels as possible.
Thank you. Question, Katie, that Stephen asks. How is the Boston program being publicized so that people who need it know about it? And Judith Wright it sends in a question to say that there are programs in Cambridge under the Mayor's Disaster Relief Fund that residents can apply for. But again, I guess my question is, how do we get the word out about these? Do people know what help is available?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, short of surveying renters out in the city of Boston and talking with nonprofit partners, I can't be sure sort of how widely disseminated the information is among the people who most need it. What to me was encouraging about the Boston program, so I collected these data, and I can tell you there's really big variation in the quality of city websites and city press releases on these issues. And Boston's information was incredibly easy to find. If you Google Boston rent trouble or Boston rent COVID, the city website with details about the program come up very quickly. So I take that as at least a positive sign of some communication strategies, but I think I can't speak to sort of how the outreach strategy is going on the ground. They're also partnered with two nonprofit agencies, Metro Housing Boston and the Neighborhood of Affordable Housing. And so I suspect those partners are also working to disseminate the message among folks who most need it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce, question from Gabriel. Can you further describe the nature of these new potential business models for small businesses? Could the outcome of this crisis be a replacement of small businesses with large corporate chains that have the capital to survive this crisis? Presumably you'd say, Bruce, that what we're trying to achieve with the networks is avoiding that.
Yeah, this is a great question. I wrote a piece called Community Wealth about a year ago. Actually, I've lost complete sense of time, so maybe it was more recent than that, with a close friend of mine named Ross Baird. And I think what we've seen in many low-income neighborhoods in the United States is the invasion of parasitic capital and low-quality big box retail. And so many of our low-income neighborhoods don't have vibrant commercial corridors like they did 50 years ago. That has been lost. And frankly, many of our low-income neighborhoods, particularly in parts of the country that haven't done very well since the 2008-2009 recession, have still not recovered. And that's where you really see the full-on decimation of local commerce. So I am greatly fearful that in the aftermath of this crisis, the large will crush the small. And we will see many of our low-income neighborhoods and other parts of cities see a larger portion of their commerce controlled by big box retail, which means that income and wealth will be extracted and sent somewhere else, since many of those corporations are obviously not headquartered in the cities that they serve. So think Family Dollar or the dollar stores, or obviously Walmart and beyond. That is why I think, A, we need to preserve as many of these small entrepreneurs and businesses as we can, though it's getting pretty late in the game. And Washington is still playing a lot of games as opposed to just getting the work done. And if that doesn't happen and we lose 30, 40, 50% of existing small businesses in many of our cities, particularly in our neighborhoods, then I think we're going to have to fast find some new models. And the models I'm thinking about are used in Europe and frankly in some parts of the United States. They tended to have been used in central markets. If you go to York, Pennsylvania, for example, and you go to their central market, there's sort of one unified landlord that provides a platform for food stalls and food operations. Well, that could apply to really multiple sectors of local commerce. But what you need is that foundational organization serving multiple purposes. And then you need different kinds of cooperative financing and bank financing to make all this work. So I'll be writing about this in the next week or two, because we need to now start preparing for the reopening of our economy whenever it's going to occur, if it's going to require new models and particularly new kind of financing products to get it going.
Bruce, that raises a question that I wanted to ask, which is, in these networks, where does the capital come from?
Well, the capital can come from multiple sources. So there is a crowdfunding cooperative ownership piece to some of these models. You can buy shares in some of these cooperative entities, not necessarily for dividends or returns, but because it's a matter of civic pride and communal ownership. Obviously in Europe, there's more of a tradition of cooperative banks and cooperative credit that obviously operate with stronger connections to these kind of models than they do in the United States. So we do have credit unions, obviously, in the US. We do have banks that are been capitalized by labor unions and so forth. So it's not like we don't have some of these models, but they've not been the dominant model here. It's been a model of really individualistic capitalism as to more collective capitalism. And make no mistake, these cooperative models are capitalistic in nature, but they just have different kind of ownership mechanisms and different divisions of responsibilities for different aspects of business than individual business would have. So this is what we're exploring right now. You know, this has been talked about in the US for 50 years. It might actually take a crisis like this to get us to move forward on some of these very different kinds of ownership strategies and business strategies than we've done before.
Thank you. Katie, this is in a way asking you to anticipate the results of your research before you've done it. But Saiwa asks, how do we understand differences in local government responses to the current crises, given the structural inequalities between cities, San Francisco versus Detroit, and within cities such as New York?
Yeah, so I think being able to put together some of these incredibly generous rent relief packages is a form of financial privilege for cities, and we will see that some cities have the funds to do this. while other cities that are already facing fiscal crises will simply not have the resources to engage in these kinds of rent relief or property tax relief programs. I think the reason that eviction bans or moratoriums are by far the most popular response among large cities is because, at least in the short run, they're incredibly cheap to do. You don't have to provide a multi-million-dollar relief package to stop evictions. And so I think there was a really pressing public health reason to do that, and probably like a moral reason, right, to do that. But there's also this financial reason that it was one of the easiest things that you could do as a city to help people in need without spending lots of money. So I think that's one part that we will definitely see these inequalities between cities. But I think this issue of inequality within cities is also really important. We're seeing some neighborhoods being deeply affected by these housing-related issues and public health-related issues from COVID-19, while other neighborhoods have remained relatively insulated. And so, given patterns of racial and economic segregation in the United States, these effects will be clustered. And that's going to be true whether you're in a rich city or in a poor city. And that clustering is going to create really important governance challenges. And hopefully local governments and state governments and the federal government are up to the task of dealing with the sort of concentration of those issues.
Thank you. Bruce, I know that this has been a concern of yours for some time, but Pasquale asks whether, we had this saying, didn't we, in 2008, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And Pasquale, in a way, echoes that question about the current crisis. Is this an opportunity for cities to sort of rethink their strategies, particularly in relation to small businesses versus large business? I know that before the crisis hit, Bruce, you were very concerned with the wealth gap and trying to foster entrepreneurship and therefore wealth creation in underprivileged communities. Do you think that out of this crisis we may see the opportunity to refocus cities' efforts in that direction more?
I think it's a great question. I think what this crisis has exposed is how much our safety net has been shredded in the United States over the past 40 or 50 years, and how much we've degraded the public sector, frankly, at all levels, to be able to perform with focus and discipline and effectiveness. So I think what could happen in the aftermath of this crisis will be calls for significant bolstering of our safety net. It really depends on what happens in the 2020 election, to tell you the truth, because so much of this is going to require federal leadership around basic platform setting, health, housing, food security, income supplements. I mean, what we're finding here is that this crisis has shown deep disparities, racial, ethnic, geographic, on income, health, and wealth, but this gap between wages and prices. And we always talked about so much of the country living from paycheck to paycheck. We now see the consequences of that. I think what we also need to focus on is institutional transformation. Crises in the past have tended to lead to either new institutions or consolidated institutions at the federal level, and in the 19th century at the city level. So we got the Homeland Security Administration after 9/11. We got the Consumer Protection Administration agency after the 08-09 crisis. I have a piece coming out tomorrow which will call for institutional transformation at all layers of government and all levels of our society. City level, intercity, so we can spread innovations more quickly. Federalism, so we can tighten the relationships between the federal, state, and local governments. What we now have is conference call federalism. Obviously, that doesn't work. And then finally, the federal government. I don't think we just need a new Department of Pandemics. I think we need a new Small Business Administration with new data, with new products, with new delivery systems, new ecosystems at the local level. It's time to get a grip. I mean, we're operating as if this is circa 1990 with our Small Business Administration. Last time I checked, we had entered the 21st century. We need a complete overhaul of this. And hopefully this crisis can lead us to do that. But it's going to depend on who wins this election, to tell you the truth.
Katie, Julie asks a very important and basic question. Where does the money come from for the programs that you've been talking about, particularly, for example, the rent relief program?
Yeah, so I just checked that, and the city of Boston just says city funds, which means that they are getting it from their local revenue streams. This isn't like from some external grant. But one of the things that Max Palmer and I are actually working on is generating a policy brief from these data and going out and actually talking with local housing officials. And that is top of head questions, sort of how are you getting these things funded? Are you reallocating revenue streams? How are you addressing these policy challenges? Because I suspect each city is coming up with its own approach, and it would be incredibly helpful to document what those financial approaches have been. So that's on the to-do list, and I'm hoping to have a much better answer in a week or two.
Question for both of you. Kate raises a question that's been on my mind for the last few days. What are the short and long-term impacts of this crisis on cities? Are cities going to be perhaps even physically reshaped by this? One of the concerns that I've had as somebody who's committed to cities and studying them is whether this crisis will take the shine off cities, that maybe with affordability questions and congestion problems, cities were beginning to lose some of the luster they had for the last 20, 25 years. But I've heard people say this will be very bad for public transportation. People won't trust being crammed together on the T or the subway or the metro, whatever you call it, in your city in the future. Other people have said, this process, working at a distance, is going to reduce the need for people to be in close physical proximity. Again, possibly bad for cities. So I wonder if I could ask both of you to muse what the impacts on cities might be of the crisis that we're passing through.
Well,
Bruce, do you want to
Katie, would you like to go first? Or I'm happy to start.
Go ahead, yeah.
The bottom line is, if there's no cure or vaccine, this is going to be a very long and painful recovery. The rebirth of cities, in my view, was as much around preferences, demographic preferences, behavioral changes among different segments of our population as about policy. And so there's going to be large behavioral effects here. If people believe it's not safe to congregate. And that's going to be in a restaurant, on a main street, in a sports stadium, in a concert venue, in a movie theater. I mean, the knock-on effects of this could be very, very substantial for a long time. I do think certain macro dynamics are going to play out in cities. We have found out really also, as we found out about the income, wealth, and health disparities, what the digital divide really means. The most important infrastructure investment we need to make in the near term, particularly if there's no cure or vaccine, is equal access to high-speed internet, because that's how so many of us are going to be operating for a period of time. That's, from my perspective, the most essential infrastructure investment that needs to be made. The other thing that this crisis is showing is the variance across cities of how strong their networks are. I think that the cities that have strong public, private, civic, university, community engagement, where they can actually co-problem solve and co-invest and co-lead, are cities that are going to come out of this, I think, stronger and quicker. So the conversations I've been having in the last week, as we just tentatively begin to move from rescue to recovery, has been around the network effect of cities and how to strengthen that even more. But this crisis is so vast that it's impossible for one sector of a city leadership network to, to lead by themselves. So I think there's a lot of unknowns out there right now as to what the nature of a rebound is going to look like. But there's some fundamentals like digitalization and, frankly, Graham, education and skilling. If there's one thing I think that's going to come out of this very soon from now, we have too many unemployed people in this country who are not going to go back to work. What should they do? They should go back in for 3 months, 6 months, reskilling in their community colleges and in workforce development programs, maybe around entrepreneurial training, maybe around certain technological skills. This is where cities are going to be so fundamentally important, because this is happening starting this summer. And we probably need a GI Bill for this, to basically enable people to have the wherewithal to go literally back to school, because they're not coming back into the workforce anytime soon. There's no, light switch to flip here. It's going to be slower.
Thank you, Bruce. Scary and inspiring at the same time. Katie, what do you think?
I mean, I share a lot of these worries. As someone who deeply believes that we need to be building more high density housing, both for affordability and climate change reasons, I really worry that people's preferences for that kind of housing are going to change, and that major challenges that the construction industry is facing right now are going to make it even harder to build this kind of housing that we so desperately need in many American cities. So yeah, I think that is definitely something I worry about, and worry about for the future of our American urban landscape. I think too, maybe places for some optimism that I've seen emerging out of this crisis. The first is the way that we're rethinking the use of green space right now. Now more than ever, I think people are realizing that they need places that they can walk to and recreate outside, and in this particular moment with some distance from other people. And that in many communities, it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to walk somewhere. And so we're seeing really exciting developments. Again, I highlighted Oakland in my housing innovation, but they also have been incredibly innovative in closing down a ton of streets so that people can walk in those streets, people can bike in those streets. And it would be amazing if this could prove to be a catalyst for people to move away from using cars for all of their transportation needs in urban areas. So I think that's good. The other sort of potentially hopeful development out of all of this has been increasing regional cooperation. We know that the inability of sort of different local governments within a metropolitan region to work together is a major obstacle for solving a lot of important collective action problems, things like metropolitan traffic. And so it's encouraging to see local governments working together in really constructive ways to coordinate on things like school closures, on things like how to manage restaurants and food delivery. And so hopefully those partnerships can be durable. Hopefully the kinds of relationships between governments, between different local governments and between different local governments and nonprofit actors can be durable and help cities to be resilient even after this crisis is over.
Thank you. I'm going to shift direction now towards, if you like, activism. What can we do? And Gabriel asks, which of these issues will arise as major points of debate in the 2020 presidential election? But Gabriel also asks, what should activists focus on in terms of pressuring the federal government about these issues? So if we sort of think of ourselves not just as scholars, but as citizens, where should we be putting our energies in terms of trying to move public policy forward? Bruce, do you want to give us a priority list?
Yeah, I think, the election is not that long from now, but also a lifetime in politics, right? I mean, if the election was held today, it would probably be a referendum of the extent to which the federal government was or was not prepared for this crisis, and the extent to which it has reacted with any consistency and effectiveness. Obviously, a lot of folks on this call will probably say that the federal government has been dysfunctional and was fundamentally unprepared. And every day we're subject to the president giving completely inconsistent remarks on just about every topic imaginable. So if there was a referendum today, I think we would have a new president, but it's a long time between now and November. And so and we don't know how this election will actually take place. Watching the scenes from Wisconsin last week with social distancing to get to the polls, I mean, this could get ugly pretty quickly. So it's really critical to focus on the election, because this is, we always talk about elections of our lifetimes. This is an election of our century, frankly. I do think that what the country needs at all levels is going to be a broader variety of solutions to the kinds of issues that we're facing now. I mean, again, the small business issue, I've been intensely focused on these new business models. Luckily, we have Northern Europe as an alternative to look to, but that's just on one particular issue. As we're looking, for example, as I mentioned before, at skills training and, you know, essentially not a trade adjustment, but a technology adjustment that has to occur post-crisis. Where are the models for that? And can we quickly adapt and scale them? So I think what activists can do, particularly those in the idea space, is offer up new ideas that probably have been tested elsewhere. There may be proven models. And then the question is not just to codify them, but to really describe how do you adapt them from one kind of culture or one kind of system to ours. The US is the most diverse country on the planet. It also tends to be the most parochial. We tend to basically think, well, we're number one, and you know, are we really going to learn from the Germans, let alone the Danes, let alone, you know, many of the leading countries in Asia and beyond? So we need to get outside of ourselves and use this as a moment to remake our institutions and radically overhaul many of our policies. So that's where activists can be, I think, incredibly helpful right now.
Thank you. Katie, what's your take? What should we be pushing for as citizens as well as scholars?
Yeah, so like Bruce, I think we should be really focused on election administration right now. You know, after what happened in Wisconsin, I think we really need to be thinking about how do we safely administer an election in the fall in a world where we don't have a cure, where we don't have a vaccine. And I think vote by mail is going to be an incredibly important component of that. And so folks need to be getting in touch with their elected representatives at all levels to try to make this a reality. I think the second thing that I would encourage activists to do is to actually not just be thinking about the federal level. I think in many respects what this crisis has shown us is that our state and local governments can do a lot, and we should hold them accountable for what they did. Some local leaders have done an amazing job. You know, many people have singled out Mayor London Breed as a leader and someone who has likely saved a lot of lives in San Francisco by acting early and decisively in response to this crisis. That hasn't been the case for all local leaders and state leaders in the country. And so I encourage folks to think about, really evaluate carefully what their local leaders have actually done and to hold them accountable for that.
Terrific points. As Katie says, I think there's been a lot of variation in the quality of response by particularly governors around the country. I hadn't really thought much about this before the crisis as an aspect of federalism, but I think that perhaps one of the advantages of our federal system is that when there is a gap at the national level, there are these other office holders who at least have the opportunity to step forward and provide the leadership that's been lacking at the national level. And as you've both said, we do have some terrific examples of mayors and governors who've stepped forward and taken responsibility when Washington didn't. I want to end now by thanking the audience for their attention. Thank you for the people who submitted questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I'm particularly grateful to our speakers for taking the time to sharing their knowledge with us. So thank you both, Katie and Bruce.